There's an unresolved question at the core of what British Columbia is. A question that all of us, government, institutions, industry, you and I, have been trying to avoid answering for almost 200 years. What are Indigenous people's rights to this land? One way or another, we're going to find out. This is the Tyee Podcast. I'm your host, Harrison Mooney. Every episode, we dive deeper into the stories shaping the West Coast, because Canada needs more BC. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, or DRIPA, was considered a milestone for reconciliation when it was passed in 2019. But after a couple of major court decisions declared that all those nice promises were actually enforceable law, the mood changed. Earlier this spring, Premier David Eby ignited a firestorm when he tried to dismantle DRIPA, first by saying he would amend it, then suspend it, then backing off the idea completely when his own party revolted. Now the province is scrambling over the summer to figure out a new path forward. According to Adam Olsen, this moment was inevitable. The former BC Green Party MLA was there when DRIPA was passed. He was in those meetings Eby held this past spring with Indigenous leaders, and he explains on today's show how this mess is the consequence of more than a century of ignoring treaty rights, and how there may be a way to ease our political hangover. Stay with us. Hi, Adam. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. All right. Well, yeah, let's just get into this. I think the first thing we should do is try to bring our listeners up to speed. Adam, what is DRIPA?
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. It is an act that was passed in 2019 unanimously by that's all members of the BC legislature. At the time, there was 87 of us. I was the member of Saanich North in the Islands. I was one of three Greens in a confidence and supply agreement with the BC NDP's minority government. And it was a very unique time in British Columbia history in 2017.
So just unanimous support then. And now it seems like it's becoming, we'll say, more complicated. You know, I know that David Eby is being criticized for mishandling it now. Why? And what's changed since the unanimous support from back then?
Well, I think that there are both global and national politics at play here. That's impacting BC politics for sure. We're seeing the impact of social media and the pile-on effect that can happen. The outrage machines of social media really reward increasingly outrageous behavior on social media. Gets rewarded. It creates virality. You know, back in about 2023, 2024, we started to see in BC a split in the political right. So it was the BC United at the time. John Rustad is out of the BC United caucus. He becomes the leader of the BC Conservatives, and he really starts to drive what is the beginning of this anti-Indigenous sentiment that we see. That all of these factors had a very substantive impact on the tone and tenor of the conversation, the dialogue that's happening right now. And the opposition has spent the last 2 years since spending almost every day in question period just hammering on the Declaration Act, just hammering on reconciliation. And one BC emerges out of that BC Conservative Party in a very same way that the BC Conservatives emerged out of the BC United. And they've driven that narrative even further to the right. Before we get to the business as usual in Canada, there's two pieces that of this story that really supercharged this. The first is the Cowichan decision, and the second is the Gitgatla decision on the Mineral Tenures Act and the justiciability of the Declaration Act to all BC law. These are two court decisions that the British Columbia official opposition and other opposition parties at One BC have paid an awful lot of attention on. In fact, they've kind of blended them and they have used these decisions as their primary attack on David Eby and the BC NDP And rather than really standing up and using this moment to try to explain to British Columbians the history of this province and why it is that we find ourselves in the situation we find ourselves in Crown Indigenous relations, the BC NDP government has made some very curious decisions in how that it is going to frame its response to this. And in many respects, one of my primary criticisms over the last number of months is that they played right into the hands of those opposition parties, trying to not lose votes or something. It feels like it's been a very political response rather than what we need is a very measured public policy response, which is what the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act actually was meant to be, was a measured response to this long history in this province that we have.
Yeah, as an underinformed observer, like this seems like a really Canadian problem where we want to be able to say one thing and do something else. So we've passed this act, we've put our commitments in writing, made our words legally enforceable, but it seems to have also changed everything, or at least threatens to change everything about how we do business in British Columbia. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, look, I'll just say this. The Declaration Act was intended to be a recognition of Indigenous rights and title in a way that this province has never done. We have a history of denying it, going right back to the founding figures of this province. Joseph Trutch basically said, Indigenous people, Indian people had no rights to their land, no rights to their territories, and it was open for preemption and settlement for settlers and people, Europeans heading this way. And so the Declaration Act was supposed to take us out of the court system. It was supposed to put us at the negotiating table. And I think that what we've seen over the last several years is the slow implementation of it, unfortunately, of the Declaration Act, unfortunately, has led us to court decisions that have been both inevitable and inescapable for this province. We were eventually going to get there if the Crowns continue to use the courts as the primary place where these issues were going to be resolved, then we were always going to end up where we're at today. Where the government is failing to move these issues forward with any expediency, the courts become the place that government is held accountable for those decisions. The First Nations bring their issues to the court to have them answer the question, rather than finding those answers at the negotiation table, which is what the Declaration Act at its core was supposed to do. It was supposed to create a space where we could sit down and negotiate based on recognition of Aboriginal rights and title, rather than First Nations having to go to court to force the government to recognize it because they're taking this position of denying Aboriginal rights and title.
I appreciate you bringing up Joseph Trutch because, I think we can all agree that he was the worst. But, he kind of takes over as the deal maker after James Douglas is pushed out of Victoria, right? And I've been reading a lot about this because James Douglas fascinates me as just the most compromised black man in BC political history. He made his own little deals, and they were kind of unofficial. He'd have his paper and it would just be like, put an X here to say that this is our land forever. But he at least had some sense, especially after working with the Hudson's Bay Company, of Indigenous people are people. And then after the gold rush and after all of these, these miners come up and Victoria becomes suddenly overwhelmingly white, racism spikes. He's pushed out, Trutch is brought in, and he undermines all the work that Douglas did. It seems like what's happening here with DRIPA is that it's really bringing us back to, the early BC history, like how this really all started. I wonder if all of this anger and confusion that we're seeing now is happening because First Nations suddenly have rights they always should have had.
I think that there's an awakening for British Columbia that British Columbia is experiencing right now to the history. Like I said, I used two very specific words: inescapable and inevitable. Right? Yeah. We are at our inevitable. We are meeting this moment, and it is an inevitable moment. We were eventually going to get here, and that there's this time in the early 20th century where the federal government outlawed Indigenous people from going and hiring lawyers and raising money to hire lawyers to defend themselves in the court, delaying the inevitable. Because as soon as First Nations started to be able to hire lawyers and raise money to take these issues to court, the courts started to make their first decisions to the benefit of the fact that Indigenous rights and title were not extinguished. There are not treaties across British Columbia. And so the reconciliation began. Even in 1876, the Governor General, Lord Dufferin, comes out here and says, whoa, 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 whoa. You guys, you are unique in this country. And we have to admit that since Douglas left office, it's real bad. You've not been following the Crown's own through the Royal Proclamation that you have to settle these affairs with Indigenous people, the Indigenous people of the land, before we can just start settling it in a wholesale way. You have to settle those accounts. You have to settle those affairs. You have to reconcile the land title. BC took the position, no, we don't. No, we don't. They have no rights. So Douglas, as you pointed out, Douglas started from what was like a fur trader's perspective, where relations with First Nations was much different than the settler perspective. The settler colonial project was a different project than the fur trade project. And I think that it's important to acknowledge that the mindset of these two generations of Europeans that show up here was likely very, very different, in the sense that Douglas, in order for the fur trade to be successful, needed to have more positive relations with First Nations, because they were bringing these goods to trade at these forts with the Hudson's Bay Company. Douglas was seized with the instructions by the Crown that you have to settle these. And so he started to create treaties on southern Vancouver Island. And there's lots of questions about those treaties, and we don't need to get into them here, but just the act in and of itself identifies that Douglas had a different perspective. And that's what Lord Dufferin was referencing, saying, like, look, the BC was on a track, it was starting. Well, that mindset totally shifted once Trutch and his crew came in. There was this whole generation of reserve reductions, these cutbacks that happened, and then in the early 20th century, then the McKenna-McBride Commission goes through and, they try to take the last remaining acre that they could possibly squeeze out of the already impossibly small Indian reserves in British Columbia. And so, I think that this history is really important. And I think the fear that comes is in part the unknowing of the actual history of how we got it here, the injustice that has occurred decade after decade after decade, and has been maintained decade after decade. And the fear also comes from the unknown of how to potentially unwind and solve this problem that we now confront in 2026. This is based on the British common law, right? This is not Indigenous people turning to their own Indigenous legal orders and saying, oh, you did a bad job. This is the First Nations people turning to the British system of law that they brought with them on those ships, and by their own standards, by their own rule of law, or by our own standards and our own rule of law, collectively as a society.
Right, like they say, this is your law, and it's unjust by your own law. After the break, why the government's response to DRIPA is doing more harm than any court case ever could. Stay with us. There's this quote from David Eby that I find downright delicious. He said, while this work is essential to our success, it could also be the undoing of our province as a place to do business. Now, am I nuts? Or is this problem with DRIPA really more of a problem with how we have been doing business all this time?
Well put. I was on a panel earlier last weekend, and, I said that the province is not running out, that the provincial politicians are not running out to protect individuals' private property rights. The political rhetoric sounds like it. What they're protecting is the system that they built on top of it. They didn't solve the question in the land. They built this system, this land management system, on top of this unresolved question. And we have been trying to evade answering that question ever since. We've tried to escape it. And we have been unsuccessful at it. And David Eby's quote is more of the same of what we've seen generation after generation after generation. Indigenous people are a threat to the security of our province. That's kind of the underlying core of what the Premier is saying, that Indigenous rights create uncertainty. No, we don't. No, they don't. What creates uncertainty is a government that's trying to evade its responsibility, not just to Indigenous people, but to all British Columbians who rely on the systems that the government has said we should all rely on. The Land Act and all the land management and all the other systems that the government has built on there. Confidence in those systems is really important. It's not Indigenous people's rights that are the inconvenience in this. It is the government's response to the fact that Indigenous people have rights. And it's rooted in this perspective going all the way back to the very beginning, that those founders of this province, ingrained in our DNA is this belief that Indigenous people don't have rights. And so therefore, anything that we do for Indigenous people is a gift to them. It's not the case. It's that we have this unreconciled question that needs to be reconciled. And the Declaration Act, again, is a solution to that. Repealing it, which is what the political right, and this is where I think it comes back to the very first question that you asked me, and I answered it in a very political, like I answered the politics of the moment. We've got the political right who has driven this so far to a point where actually what they're proposing is the solution to this, potentially causes way more havoc and concern than the situation that we're in right now. Repealing the Declaration Act is not just a matter of public policy, changing the public policy, especially when you don't have a solution of what you're going to replace that public policy. Like, what is the public policy you're going to replace the public policy with?
Right.
And they've not been able to answer that. The second piece is that it's symbolic. When First Nations, who are now increasing in sophistication, whose administrations are all increasingly more sophisticated, see that the government is repealing this act, which is a basic expression of their human rights.
Right.
Symbolically, that sends a message that we are now in confrontation with this entity. We are no longer in partnership with it.
I have this analogy that keeps jumping into my mind. Are you familiar with Archie Lee, the 1850s California case? Can I get way in the weeds about history with you? All right, so 1850s California, San Francisco, gold rush is winding down. Slavery is still U.S. law, but California is a free state. So there's this famous case, Archie Lee versus Charles Stovall. And Stovall, the slave owner, brings Lee to California, and he settles there. But then he finds out that means that Archie Lee is free now. So he tries to take him on a steamship back to Missouri. Like, let's get out of here. But the problem is that as soon as he grabs Archie Lee now, it's considered kidnapping. So he winds up being arrested, and then he goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court finds that Charles Stovall is right according to the Fugitive Slave Act, and then Archie Lee is put in jail, and Stovall's released, and this goes back and forth like maybe 3 or 4 times in California's kind of early court system as they're figuring out their laws and their government, and eventually the state of California basically decided that just all the black people needed to leave. Like, this is too complicated. We don't want to be a slave state, but we also don't want to empower black folks, give them the same rights as everybody else, or undo the racist laws that, all of our other laws are based on. Too many legal complications. And it just kind of seems like the same thing is happening here with DRIPA and reconciliation. Like, what we have done is we've really just highlighted the racism at the core of BC's entire structure, land structure, business structure, and people don't want to deal with that.
The vast majority of the elected, or majority of the parties in there, are treating Indigenous people as if they're a liability. Even the Premier is framing the liability that now GitGatla, or the Mineral Tenure Act and the justiciability of the Declaration Act on all the laws of BC. It's a massive liability. BC has been carrying a massive liability since the beginning. And every day that we do not reconcile, every day that we do not start to try to answer that fundamental question, the land question, the liability increases. And so the liability is not new. This goes back to the question that you asked earlier on. It's just that a lot of people are starting to realize what the liability is. And the provincial government has done a tremendous job and has become very skilled at placing Indigenous people between them and their constituents. So the provincial politicians have been able to put Indigenous people in between them and the public. So the focus, you want to be afraid of something, be afraid of Indigenous rights. Don't be afraid of a crown that is not fulfilling its responsibility to all British Columbians. Don't be mad at them. And that's consistently what's happened over and over and over in the history of this province. That happened again with the Gitkaalik decision, December the 5th. Somewhere between the decision coming down that morning and just later on that or early afternoon, David Eby standing up at a press conference and he says, you know what, I'm open to amending the Declaration Act. Before sitting down with the chief of the Gitkaalik and saying, what does this mean and how do we work this out? Before sitting down with the First Nations Leadership Council and saying, how are we going to figure this out? He goes to the media and he says, I'm open to amending it. Now, the frame of that is we're going to amend the Declaration Act. And he plays right into the hands of the political right, which is saying that we need to repeal it. He is now agreeing that it's the problem.
Right. Yeah, he's empowered them.
Rather than having our government running around the province with their hair lit on fire, saying, everything is terrible. It would have been much better for the people of British Columbia to see their elected leaders take a deep breath and say, just like all of these other decisions, there is a resolution and we have to figure out what it is, how it is that we're going to address that, how it is that we're going to implement the decisions of the court.
Adam, is it wrong for me to harbor like a smidgen of sympathy for David Eby in all this? Being in charge of the swiftly unraveling settler colonial project seems pretty hard, even when you choose to unravel it yourself. Opposition parties have criticized Eby for failing to properly communicate with the public, like you're saying. But part of me wonders how they can when they really can't even answer the most pressing question, which is, and I'm going to put this to you as well, what actually is the government's obligation to First Nations?
Feel bad for David Eby in the same way that you feel bad for anybody that was left holding this bag. Some premier was going to hold this bag at this moment, at this time, and it happens to be David Eby. So you can feel bad for him or feel bad for his government that they've found themselves at this spot. But they've also, because they've had a specifically political response to this rather than a public policy response to it. They have chosen to politicize this issue rather than to put it in places that depoliticize this issue. So that's where my sympathy for the way this government has handled this ends. It doesn't matter whether they are on the right or the left. The government that is left holding this has a responsibility to it, to unpacking this history and being leaders in this moment. This BC NDP government has made some decisions and the premier has made some statements that has actually made this a much more challenging issue than the one it had he not made those statements. And so I think that's where personally my sympathy for him in this moment diminishes, because he doesn't need to go out on the same day that Gitkaalik decision comes out and says that he's open to amending the declaration. He doesn't need to do that. He can say, look, the decision just came down today. We're going to review it. This is just stock comms, and the language is definitely there from every other time the courts have made a decision,
right,
and they haven't had a chance to review it yet. What do they say? We're reviewing it. We're going to, figure out what our options are, and we'll get back to you next week.
We're going to sleep on it. Yeah.
He didn't sleep on it, right? He just went immediately out and said, I know what I'm doing. I'm open to amending it. And now it's not a question of whether or not it should be amended or what the 5 different options are and how we're going to deal with this situation. It's how much are you going to amend? And so, unfortunately, what happened was Eby just moved himself on the political spectrum to just kind of right before where the Conservatives were at. He left all that space for him to operate in. And I think that was one of the real challenges over the last 5 or 6 months that has, on the government side, that has accelerated this issue when actually their actions could have slowed the issue down, calmed the nerves, took some time to to communicate and to educate the province as to why we're at where we're at that moment. Only the government has the ability to just calmly approach this and say, look, we are methodically going to approach this in the way that we approach other decisions that are made. So that's the first part of the question. Now, the second part of the question you asked was,
what actually is the government's obligation to First Nations? In 30 seconds. No.
Well, the government's obligation to First Nations is to find constructive ways to reconcile the rights and title issue that has existed in this province. The obligation is to sit down at the table with First Nations and work that out. It's not to become overwhelmed by the complexity and, oh my goodness, there's 200 First Nations and how are we going to do it? No, it's to calmly work through the problem that you have, which is a lot of First Nations communities and 170 years of history. That's a challenging situation. Don't become overwhelmed by it, but put together a program that does it. I think that we have an obligation as a society to find ways to work with First Nations to remedy the socioeconomic gap that exists as a result of public policy. The wealth of this province has produced one set of results on one side of the line, and the impoverished system that's been created on Indian Reserve has produced a different outcome. We don't need to do that anymore by changing the public policy. And this goes to the third piece to this that I want to highlight, and that is depoliticizing this issue. Because it doesn't matter whether it's an NDP government or a Conservative government or a Green government or any government. When the NDP were the first government in this country to pass the Declaration Act, there was a lot of celebration for that. There was a lot of congratulations for that. I was at some of those meetings where the NDP, Premier Horgan and his team would come in and they would just get showered with gratitude for doing the impossible in this province. And today I hold late Premier John Horgan in very high regard because he was the first premier to stare this issue down and say, I'm going to look at it in a different way. And there is an amount of political courage and political capital that he expended, political courage that he needed to have in order to be able to look down this and say, no, we're gonna do this in the entirely different way than any government has ever done it in this province. So he does deserve that. However, the victory laps and the congratulations that they received as a party,
maybe a little premature.
Well, I think that when you politicize this issue and you try to gain the points from doing the right thing, and you try to not let it damage you, and I think that that's to some extent, what the BC NDP is trying to do right now is they're positioning that they see that, oh my goodness, the public sentiment might have changed. How do we play into that? We need a government that's going to lead through this right now. We need a government that even when it gets tough to say, actually, no, you know what? Even though the political winds have changed, I need to tell you, the legal issues remain. We need to be as keenly interested in this now as we were in 2019 when we were passing the law in 2020.
All of this puts David Eby at the center of a huge political mess. But Adam Olsen says there might be a way out and a beacon of hope for reconciliation. That's when we come back. According to a document leaked last month, Eby has outlined a plan to puzzle out how to move forward on DRIPA before the fall session begins in October. And that plan includes a steering committee, a task force, and a smaller consultative body. Can you explain the difference between a committee, a task force, and a consultative body? Or at least explain the logic behind that structure that he's proposing?
So I think those are all how his government, or how the BC government, that his government is going to relate to First Nations. What I was just talking about was how does his government relate to the official opposition and the other opposition parties inside the legislature? So one of the ways to depoliticize this, and I'll get to what he's proposed in just a second, but I want to talk about this Aboriginal Affairs Committee for just one more minute here.
Please, yes.
These select standing committees are the most productive spaces that I worked in, the most collaborative spaces. This is where I learned the most as an MLA. And so, I never thought that I was going to get into in public safety and policing, but I got put on the policing committee, and I learned a lot about policing and a lot about the, relationships of policing in society, and way more than I ever thought that I would learn. And I also became far more familiar with my colleagues from all parties in that space, because it was the lights of question period were not on. We were meeting together. We were getting to know each other. It was a very collaborative environment. And in the end, it's the only place in the legislature where the report is consensus. So if there wasn't full agreement by all members of the committee, it doesn't make it in the report, which is remarkably different than every other kind of conversation that is had in that place. So I've been saying we should be moving this conversation right now of how we reconcile and how we address this long-standing intergenerational problem or intergenerational issue of not answering the land question, move it into the Aboriginal Affairs Committee. Empower the chair, empower the committee through terms of reference to work as a collaborative institution with members of the Conservatives, with members of the Greens, with members of the government, and to come up with a consensus report on what needs to happen. That's where solution making happens. That's where you start to, they can bring in witnesses, hear testimony. You can hear both sides. You can bring in the historians and have them, and it can be an educative process for all of British Columbians, because then you can have the reporters reporting on what was said in the committee. So rather than creating a task force and a committee and a whatever it was, whatever the three variations of tables that the Premier was going to set up, which may very well be what needs to happen between the government and First Nations leadership, I think the most important work needs to be the government needs to take the responsibility of this issue and share it among all the members of the Legislative Assembly and say, this is not on just the government. This is on the entire society, represented by all of the members of this place, to address this situation. And so what's going to happen over this summer? The Crown, through David Eby and the Attorney General, have made some statements that we face such a grand liability that we need to amend or pause sections of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. That's the only solution. I think First Nations leaders that I've witnessed in these conversations have a different point of view on that. There are 200 communities in the 200 First Nations communities in this province, and that creates a challenging environment to be working in over the next 6 months to try to find a solution and a pathway forward. And I think that there's likely going to be a working group of elected leaders, so First Nations and provincial leaders. There's likely to be a technical working groups with technicians from the Attorney General's office and from First Nations lawyers in all likelihood, or constitutional people, and so there could very well be a need and utility for the various tables that they're setting up. But I go back and I say that some of the most important work that needs to be done is within the Legislative Assembly, and by moving this conversation into the committee. When the question comes up in question period, the minister could stand up and say, "That's a great question. You're on a committee.
Thanks for the question. Join this committee.
Raise it in committee and it will be answered," right? This isn't the right venue for that kind of question. That's a complex question that you're asking. When you're dealing with systemic issues that have gone on for decades, you need a much slower process than that, a much drawn out process that allows for people to learn and allows for the legislature to be informed and to gather ideas. I think that one of the real benefits from the committees that I experienced was when we brought community members in, when we brought experts in, we actually get informed about the issue and why it is that we're facing it right now. And I think that when confronted with the history of this province and the reality that lighting your hair on fire and politicizing this issue actually makes the situation worse and does not improve our position, I think politicians may still choose to take that approach, but at least they're not taking that approach from a position of ignorance.
Yeah, there's actually a really interesting and complicated history here, and I think it's suspicious sometimes that it's so quiet and that we don't get into it, and that this is a history that you kind of have to go looking for. And I think a lot of that has to do with an unwillingness to really look at this stuff and to look at how this province was built, and engage with it. And I think that is what DRIPA is kind of going to is, we're going to do this finally. We're going to engage with this.
I remain hopeful that we will embrace good relationships and that we will depoliticize this to the point where we recognize that our society is much better when we are having good relationships, when Crown Indigenous relations are grounded in good relations, and that the poor relations or the toxic relationships are totally unnecessary for us to be successful as a society and moving forward. We celebrate British Columbia as one of the most diverse regions in all of North America with biodiversity, but we are one of the most culturally diverse, linguistically diverse. The diversity goes much further than just the ecological diversity, and that should be something that we're celebrating, and that should be something that we elevate and say, man, this is a unique place in North America and in the world, in fact, to have so many different languages and so many different beautiful cultures. And how can we learn from those, and how can we integrate those cultures and those learnings into the way that we govern ourselves, so that we can have a society that's based on reciprocity. We can have a society that's based on good relationships and respect, just basic human respect for each other. So at the end of the day, we can say what I hear our elders say when they open events and things, that, we love you. I love you. That we can show each other love rather than anger and angst and outrage. I want to go back to something that I said earlier on, and that is that the social media impact on this has been should not be overlooked. That has been inspiring outrage and been rewarding outrage. Social media rewards outrage. It is not beneficial to our society, and I think that we need to get back to finding ways that we can embrace each other and build good relations.
Yeah, I appreciate you steering clear of cynicism in your answer there. I feel like that's always so tempting, especially when we're talking about, these long-standing structural problems, especially structural racism. And we do need some hope, especially when we're thinking about social media, which is just so depressing these days. So I'm going to tack on one last one, which is, why should the rest of us have hope for reconciliation? Is this something that we really think can happen here?
Yes, of course. Of course we can reconcile. Of course we can be a society that holds itself up as making sure that we're looking out for the least of us. And I'm not just saying that in terms of First Nations. I'm saying that just as society in general, that we recognize that it is beneficial for us to lift each other up rather than push each other down. It is so much more difficult. It is so much easier to push. I could, to be outraged and push you down and say mean things about you. And that is just base human behavior. So yeah, I am always hopeful that we can achieve a society where we embrace the diversity that exists here, where we can become better for it. We can understand how it adds to us rather than how it's a diminishment of us.
Hell yeah, Adam! I'm hopeful too. Okay, let's go.
Well, I have worked, and I will say that I've worked a lot around some of the key figures in the BC NDP government. I know them to be good people, and I know that we respond to fear in crazy ways. And when people are fearful, and sometimes it doesn't bring out the best in us. And so I always remain hopeful that, whatever happened in that press conference at that moment, we had some rough patches in this I've done 1,000 interviews, and I couldn't wrap my head around some of the questions that you're asking today, as my brain was just not functioning, right? Sometimes that happens to us, and we have to be compassionate and empathetic for people. As someone who has a mixed heritage, as someone who grew up on an Indian reserve but has European ancestry through my mother, this is not like, I am not divisible. I can't separate these parts out and say, I come to this as a whole person. I am kind of that dash between the Crown Indigenous relations in that middle. And so for me, I always have to remain hopeful that we as a society are going to overcome this, because otherwise it makes existence to be very difficult.
Yeah.
You have to have these parts at war with each other. And it's totally unnecessary. So yeah, I always remain hopeful.
Yeah. From one mixed person to another, isn't it just sometimes a little bit annoying being the logical conclusion of a historical mess that started long before you were born? You're like, okay, well, so now I'm this and I'm this, and now I have to figure out how to reconcile that within myself and live in the world and feel proud and have self-love. And I feel like oftentimes we want to try to say, I'm half this and I'm half this. And the reality is that we're just all of everyone that came before us. Yeah, that can make things very tricky. Yeah.
And I hope that can be an example to people to say, actually, you know what, look, we don't have to divide ourselves. We do not have to divide ourselves as a society.
Yeah, look at me.
British Columbia is far better with all of us. It is. My grandmother was she's a Satanich elder, beautiful, beautiful person. Sequat was her name, Laura Olsen. And I was going through a really rough time in the 2000s, early 2000s. I got sat down in front of her and she said, Adam, this isn't going anywhere. None of these people are going anywhere. We have to figure out a way to live together and work together. And she goes, and you just happen to come from both parts. You're that bridge. Go and be that bridge. And so those of us who come to this with these mixed parts, all these parts, have a responsibility, or at least I've been empowered to have this responsibility to be a bridge across these cultures. And to say, look, if I can exist, then we can exist.
Wow,
if I can love who I am and where I come from in this wild mixture of different cultures that I come from, then we can.
So we are the hope for reconciliation, is what you're saying. If we can exist.
Hope. Not the hope, because that puts a lot of pressure on us. but we are an example of how we can. Yeah, we can.
Adam, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Adam Olsen is the former BC Green Party MLA for Saanich North and the Islands, and lead negotiator for the Sartlip First Nation. He's also a regular contributor to the Tyee, and his writing can be found on his Substack, adampolsen.substack.com. The Tyee is a non-profit reader and now listener-funded journalism organization, all of which is made possible thanks to the support of our Tyee Builders. We're currently in the midst of a drive to sign up 650 new recurring members by June 15th. Head over to support.thetyee.ca to sign up so we can keep publishing journalism in the public interest. That's support.thetyee.ca. Today's episode was hosted by me, Harrison Mooney. It was produced by Jacob Boone and engineered by Isaac Punnay. Our music is by Brian Binema. Join us again in 2 weeks.